Hello and welcome to Beaver Hunter's Game Models. In this video I show how I painted the Dynamo Models crew for the Sturmgeschütz from my last videos. Black panzer uniforms are just as much a topic as the P-pattern camouflage. And of course skin tones are represented as well. So if this is looking interesting to you, please stay tuned. These beautiful Dynamo Models figures were my starting point, and after removing casting residues, very few cleanup, gluing parts in place after dry fitting and closing gaps with putty where pieces were glued together, I ended up with the figures ready for some paint, and as always placed them on corks and the heads on toothpicks for better handling while painting. This process is described more in detail in my older videos. But before I started with applying paint, I used Modeler's World degreaser to clean the figures. I sprayed it straight from the bottle over all pieces to remove dust, dirt and grease from my fingers so the paint adheres better. You can also brush this stuff with a soft brush onto the figure to be extra safe and some additional mechanical cleaning. When the pieces were completely dry, I started priming them with Mr. Surfacer in a warm brown diluted with leveling thinner by Modeler's World. It was my first time using this thinner and it worked great. Super smooth finish and not that bad smelling than the Mr. Hobby leveling thinner. The primer was applied in several thin layers so it's not building up, covering details until I got a tasty brown finish. For the black panzer uniform parts I decided on a pre-coloring and started with mixing the darker shadow color from these real colors. I added black to dark grey paint until I was satisfied with the color and diluted it with a matching thinner until the consistency was good for spraying. This dark paint was then sprayed onto the black uniform parts as a base coat, again in several thin layers, making sure it reached all areas and the brown primer is completely covered. Unlike the commander, the two other crew members were not completely dressed in the black uniforms to make them more interesting, so I here only sprayed the relevant parts like the pants or jacket as clean as possible. As the counterpart to the dark shadow color, I used a very light grey and off-white to lighten the previous mix up until I was satisfied. I could check the color here at the edge of my mixing jar, making sure it's lighter than the shadow paint. This lighter paint was then sprayed from above in a flat angle, so it's covering the raised spots that would be hit by light and therefore be brighter than folds or crevices. As I made sure to not brighten up the highlight paint too much, I was afraid it would end up too greyish, the effect was kind of limited and not very spectacular. But it still created enough contrast, creating a roadmap for me to see where to place shadows and highlights in the brush painting stage. And that's the result after the airbrush stage. Like I said, not very spectacular, but all higher and deeper spots emphasized. I started the brush painting with glazes in different grey tones on different parts. After the pre-coloring, all parts were in the same dark color, and by making these glazes I wanted to bring some variation into the clothes, as I think not all parts should or could have the same color. So the commander received different colored clothes by glazes in different greys, and I repeated the glazing on the other two figures with different greys on the jacket or pants. When the glazes were completely dry, I started with defining the shadows in the deeper spots like folds and crevices, in between the legs and under armpits, all places that would receive less light like the pre-coloring showed me. I used a very dark, almost black color here from an old AK Panzer crew set and diluted this paint heavily with retarder. The advantage of using retarder compared to water is that the paint dries slower, not leaving tight marks, and I can blend it with a retarder moistened brush into the base paint. Or even remove it completely when I wasn't happy with the painted area. As the paint looks very dark and strong when wet, I waited a few minutes to let it dry and when necessary repeated painting the area with another thin layer. With the shadows done, I grabbed me pure black paint and with that painted all seams and outline details like pockets or belts. The paint was again diluted with retarder, so I could remove it when I made a mistake and it flows better from the brush. I decided to do this step now, so I could make corrections with the highlight paints later if necessary. As I was using the black paint already and I love painting details, I thought I could also paint all rank, insignias and Kragenspiegel. As this was a very delicate job, painting all these small things, I thought it might be a good idea to paint them now, so I here too could make necessary corrections with the highlight paints later. And I am very sorry if the video footage here is not perfect, but painting these small things and stay in focus is not very easy. I even painted all details on the camouflage jacket, although it's still in the primer stage. But I was in detail painting mood and here too can make corrections easily later when painting the P pattern. Did I mention that I love painting details? With the painted ranks and insignias, the uniforms look pretty good already. I want to mention that all ranks and awards were nicely sculpted on the figures and it was a joy to paint them. Now I could add the highlight colors and for this I used the base paint lightened up with a warm yellow paint. This mix was then applied onto the raised and therefore lighter parts of the uniform. The paint was again very diluted with retarder, so it stays workable longer, doesn't dry out too fast leaving tight marks, and stays slightly transparent showing the base paint underneath. Unfortunately, the way of lightening up the base paint with yellow paint didn't work out very well for the highlights on the darker jackets. The highlights turned out too bluish for my taste, as I was aiming more for grayish highlights. Also, my method of blending with a soft retarder moistened brush didn't work out very good here too. I am not sure if it was because of the used paints or my retarder getting old. So I had to take countermeasures with the help of black ink. This black ink was applied very diluted over the jacket like a glaze, toning down the unfortunate highlights, blending them into the surface, and in addition giving the jacket a deep, juicy black look. I had to work fast here as the diluted ink dried very fast leaving tight marks, so I had to make sure to blend them while they were still wet. And when looking at the result, I was almost happy that I had to make this additional step, as I think the jackets look very good now. Then came my second try of adding highlights, but with a different mix. Again, like always, the paint was diluted with retarder and applied rather thin to not cover the nice black completely. This second version of the highlights looked way better to me, and I was happy that I made this step back and reworked the uniforms, confirming that it's sometimes better to calm down, learn from the mistakes that were made and start again. At least to me, this is better than ending up with a result that doesn't satisfy me and looking at the figures or models unhappy when they are in the display case. As a last step on the black uniform parts, I used an even lighter highlight paint, slightly diluted with retarder for better flow, and with this painted the edges of the uniform parts to highlight them and give the garment more contours and depth. This also gave the pieces a more sharp and crispy look. And that's the dark uniforms done, and I could now finally move on to painting the P dot camouflage. For that I started with base painting the parts I wanted to be camouflaged with a medium brown paint. I had to start somewhere, and after studying my reference pictures I thought this would be the best way, as this paint seems to be the deepest, so to say, with the rest printed on top of it at the original. I then started to paint the big light brown spots, as they were the largest in amount and size, so it seemed logical to me to start with these. I placed them randomly in different sizes and shapes, and I can't recommend it enough to get yourself some good reference pictures for the whole process. At the whole time I made sure to not paint over the seams, so it looks like these clothes were actually sewed together from different pieces of fabric. The bigger dark green spots were painted next. They are second in amount and covered area, so I placed them in between the light brown spots randomly. As I was already using the dark green paint, I added the small dark green spots randomly over the dark and light brown areas, in a small amount, as this was what my reference pictures showed me. To integrate the bigger and brighter spots into the camouflage, I grabbed me the medium brown base paint again and placed it in small pea-like dots into these spots. Like my reference showed me, they should be more present in the light brown spots than in the dark green ones. Now I had to fill up the gaps in between the bigger spots with light brown dots, as they were by far the most present ones in this pattern. This actually took me some time, but as I really enjoy jobs like these, it was more relaxing than annoying. As the last color I placed the bright green P dots. These were more accumulated around the dark green spots like my reference showed me, so they were not as much like the light brown dots, but more in amount than the medium brown ones. And I really hope that it makes some sense at all and it's understandable what I'm trying to say. And that's the result of the camouflage basic painting with acrylics. The jacket painted in the same way but with different colors for variation. Let's continue with enamels. To unify the bright shiny colors and the dark ones, I used this green-gray enamel wash, diluted it slightly with thinner and applied it as a filter over the whole camouflaged area. This toned down the lighter colors, integrating them more into the darker ones, making it look more like one piece and less brand new. I removed the axes pulling in the crevices because I here only wanted it to change the look of the uniform and not creating fake shadows in deeper areas. On the jacket I obviously had to be more careful to not hit the insignias and ranks and change their look too. To actually create fake shadows, I used this dark brown oil wash. I applied it by brush, again diluted with the matching thinner directly into the folds, crevices and deeper areas. The advantage of this oil wash is that it's very translucent when diluted, so it doesn't look like dirt, but actual fake shadows. And it is very easy to blend and remove it with this strong thinner. So, after applying it, I let it dry for a few minutes and then used a thinner moistened brush to blend it into the uniform. As a counterpart to the just created shadows, I had to bring in some light. So I used lightened up versions of the previously used acrylic paints and repainted spots and dots with them on the raised and more to light exposed areas. Like this, I created contrast between shadows and highlights, bringing more life and shape into the clothes. And with that, this very enjoyable chapter was done. Leather parts. I started with base painting all leather parts like boots and belts with a dark brown paint. Next, as shown here, I used a lighter brown paint and applied it diluted with retarder in equal parts to paint almost the complete piece with it, except the deepest spots and crevices, so they stayed darker. For the pistol holster, I was aiming for a more reddish leather, so I changed the paint here, but the method stays the same. I then added a lighter paint to the previously used one and started to add the highlights. I therefore painted the more raised and higher areas of the pieces, making them look lighter. And again on the holster I was also adding highlights, but with different paints. I made 3 highlight rounds by adding more and more lighter paint to the previously used mix, with the painted area becoming smaller and smaller the lighter the paint became. To unify the painted highlights and bring them into a leather-like direction, I made a glaze with very strong diluted purple paint. Leather often has a slightly purple shine, and this is supposed to imply that while unifying the highlights. When the purple glaze dried completely, I used pure highlight paint and painted very thin scratches and wear and tear with a fine brush. This made the pieces look more used and not brand new. And as a finishing step, I made a glaze with the paint I started with after the dark brown base paint to bring the pieces back into a brownish direction and integrate the scratches into the surface. And that's the finished leather I'm very satisfied with. Before beginning the last big chapter, the skin tones, I wanted to finish the field glasses before painting the hand holding it. I here used black magic metal by Getz Miniatures to make a simple belt, gluing it to the field glasses. And as this was a very fiddly job, I again didn't film this. With this added detail done, I could finally move on to painting skin tones a bit more satisfied. For the skin tones, I wanted to try out a new color palette and a slightly different approach. I mixed me the deepest shadow paint and applied it onto all skin areas like faces and hands as a base paint, slightly diluted so it's not covering any details because it's too thick. I then quickly added the eyes white so I could make corrections with the base paint if necessary. Now I started with the first lighter paint, aka highlight paint 1, and with this started to paint the areas which would receive at least some light. This paint was diluted with retarder in equal parts so it stays workable longer, and I could use a dry soft brush for first blending to smoothen out the transitions. I did not paint the darkest areas like under the chin and the neck area or behind the ears and so on. But as this is just the first highlight, slightly lighter than the base paint, aka shadow paint, the painted area was rather huge. This guy has a Mestache or Rotzbremse as we call it in Germany sometimes, so this wouldn't really affect lights and shadows, but I had to keep in mind that this area between nose and mouth will be looking different later. Next I started to add a lighter paint, aka highlight paint 2. The paint was diluted slightly more so it's a bit more translucent and easier to blend into the previously painted layer. For the first light blending I stippled with the blending brush over the painted edges, what smoothes them out a bit. And as the paint became lighter, the painted areas became smaller and I painted the more raised and to light exposed areas in this step. And because the lighter areas became smaller, I had enough space to blend the edges here. This might look strange at this stage, but it will all come together with the later steps. As a second blending step and to break down the strong contrast between the darker and lighter areas more, I used the paint from the last step, diluted into a glaze-like consistency with retarder, and applied it onto the transition zones and into the darker areas. This unifies the skin tones and integrates the shadow areas more into the face. The blending brush is helpful here too for smoothing this glaze and remove excess where too much glaze was applied. And I repeated this step in several thin layers until I was satisfied. When the glazes were completely dry, I added the last highlights with Highlight Paint 3, and with this only painted the most raised and exposed areas like the forehead, nose, cheeks and ears. This paint was diluted more than Highlight Paint 2, so it's blending nicely into the glazed face. In my earlier approaches, I started with a medium paint, then added the shadows, then the highlights. That wasn't too bad at all, but I felt there was room for improvement and the older approach was better suited for bigger pieces like 1/10 bust heads in my opinion. On smaller heads like these, I wanted to try to start with the shadows and work my way to the highlights, using fewer shadow highlight tones, and so therefore had more space for these paints to work with. When the last highlight paint was completely dry, I made a glaze with very diluted magenta paint. This gave the whitish highlights back some rosiness and brought the faces more into a lifelike direction. It's very important that the paint was heavily diluted, so it's not looking too pinkish and therefore doll-like. Because of the heavy diluting, the effect of this step was kind of limited at first, but it was necessary for the final result to make it. Then came the maybe most important step, a red glaze. I placed red glazes into the shadows like under the chin, under the nose and around the eyes, but also onto the cheeks, nose and around the mouth. This implies blood circulation, what gives specific areas of faces the rosiness they need for looking more lifelike. I built up the effect in several thin layers until I was satisfied with it, adding more or less on the different heads to bring in some variation, so not all three faces look the same. And as a last step, the two guys with bare foreheads received very thin yellow glazes onto the foreheads, upper cheeks and the nose. This is to imply the look of sun-kissed warm skin being in the open. Again, it's important to use heavily diluted paint in several thin layers, because one too thick layer can make them look like malaria patients. And after quickly painting hairs and heads, that's the result of painting skin tones. I must say I am really happy how the guys came out with the new paints and approach, and I think I will continue to follow this path from now on. Before painting the eyes, I glued the heads to the bodies after some dry test fitting, because it helps me to determine the viewing direction when the heads are in place. I here use, as always, the tested and proven approach of using oil paints and two very fine brushes. With the 000 brush, I placed a small dot of this dark brown oil paint into the eyeball as pupils, trying to hit a good position and sides. And with the thinner moistened 00 brush, I went then back in and reworked the size and shape of the pupils. Like this, the eye painting becomes super easy with almost endless tries and restarts if necessary. This guy, for example, had very small and squinted eyes, what didn't make it easier. So I was glad I could easily remove the oil paint and start over again. And with some patience and a steady hand, I here too was successful in creating, at least to me, good looking eyes. Now the guys were able to see what lies ahead of them, and I really liked what I saw here. But there was one last thing to do. This guy will be sitting on the tank, so I had to use the same products I created earth and mud with on the StuG to make him match the vehicle, as his boots and legs will be visible. So, just like on the Sturmgeschütz, I applied the solution fluid to the glazes and then stippled the pigments into it. As good as these parts are looking clean, soldiers should be at least a bit dirty, even when riding in a vehicle most of the time. But as the other two guys are in the tank's hatches from waist down, I saved me some time by skipping this step on them. Now I could finally bring together what belongs together and glued the figures onto small blocks of foam I glued into the model, so the figures can stand safe instead of floating in the hatches. I like it better this way compared to gluing hands or arms to hatches, because now they have a strong connection to the tank's bottom floor. And now I can finally call these guys done. If you made it until here, thank you very much for watching. I hope my video was interesting to watch and maybe even helpful and you could learn a thing or two. I am super happy with the result on these figures. I think they are some of the best I made so far. Especially the skin tones are looking pretty promising to me, as in my earlier approach it was kind of a coin flip if they came out nice or more like what the hell is this. This approach now was kind of easier to follow and I think the chances to recreate this are better this way. I would be very happy if you support me by subscribing, and I am curious to read your feedback and thoughts about my Sturmgeschützbesatzung. So, enough said for today. Thanks again for watching, good luck for your figure painting tries, stay safe and until the next time.